Lonely rancher saved an Apache girl, then she offered herself to repay him. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to subscribe and like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The Arizona sky bled crimson, spilling fire across the canyon walls as shadows stretched long, like scars carved into the desert itself. Jonathan Hale rode slowly, his bay gelding steady beneath him, the leather reins worn smooth by years of use. His hands were calloused, steady from war and ranch work, but his heart had not beaten right since the night flames devoured his wife and son, leaving ash where laughter used to live. He carried their memory in silence, a man shaped by battles and loss. Once a Confederate soldier, later a bounty hunter, now only a rancher haunted by ghosts. He lived with a Bible whose cover was charred, a half-burned wooden cross, and a soul heavy with vows he could not keep. The canyon whispered in the dusk, the wind scraping against stone, when it came, a cry, sharp and human, slicing the stillness like a blade. Jonathan reined in, breath caught, his eyes scanning the jagged ridges ahead. Another sound followed, faint yet filled with fear. His gaze locked on a figure in the dying light, a woman, dark-haired, fierce-eyed, her dress torn and dust clinging to sweat-damp skin. Her chest rose and fell with ragged breaths, but her stance was taut, alive with desperation. Maya Redbird, an Apache woman, held her bow high, arrow notched, aimed straight at his heart. "Don't move," she hissed, her voice low, trembling, yet edged with steel. Jonathan did not flinch. War had taught him steadiness, and loss had taught him silence. He met her gaze, unyielding, steady, as if the desert itself demanded this moment to hold. For a heartbeat the world seemed to pause, her defiance against his restraint, fire against stone. A bead of sweat traced down her throat, catching the sun's last ember, and Jonathan's pulse stumbled. Something forbidden stirred inside him, a heat he thought long buried. She was danger, she was beauty, and she was running. Behind her, shadows shifted on the ridge. Riders moved like wolves, dust rising in the last light of day. Jonathan's gut tightened. Who hunted her? And why? After years of numbness, did his world tilt the moment her eyes found his? Could he turn away, as he had turned from life itself? Or had this stranger, with nothing but defiance and desperation, already claimed the part of him he swore was dead? Jonathan's fingers tightened on the reins, though he made no move to draw his rifle. The Apache woman's bow trembled slightly, but her eyes never wavered. She was cornered, desperate, and he knew the wild look in her gaze. It was the same reflection he had seen in his own after the war, after the fire. Her lips parted as if to curse him, but the sound broke into a gasp. Her strength faltered. The bow lowered by a fraction, then slipped from her hands as her knees buckled. Jonathan swung down from his horse, boots crunching on the dry earth. He approached carefully, each step measured, the way a man approached a wounded animal. She tried to rise, defiance blazing one last time, but her ankle twisted under her. She collapsed against the mesquite, her breath ragged, her face pale with pain. He saw the gash along her thigh, raw and bleeding, staining her torn dress. Her hands pressed against it, but blood seeped through her fingers like spilled wine. She looked up at him, fierce even in weakness. "Stay back," she whispered, though her voice trembled with exhaustion. Jonathan paused, watching her chest rise and fall in labored rhythm, the bow lying forgotten in the dust. He could turn away now, leave her to the fate closing in behind the ridge. He had walked away before, turned his back on men crying out in the smoke of battle, turned from his own neighbors when grief swallowed him whole. But something in her eyes, even clouded with pain, refused to let him go. A shout carried down the ridge. Riders! Their silhouettes broke against the twilight, shadows of pursuit growing nearer. Jonathan's jaw clenched. He glanced back at the woman, this stranger, this danger, and the decision made itself. He slid his arms beneath her, one hand at her back, the other beneath her knees. She stiffened, gasped, but her body yielded to his strength. The weight of her pressed against him, warm and fragile, and the scent of sage and dust clung to her skin. Jonathan carried her to his horse, lifting her into the saddle with care. He mounted behind, his arms steadying her as the gelding shifted beneath their weight. The woman sagged against his chest, breath shallow, and he felt the rapid beat of her heart. The sound of hooves thundered from the ridge. He spurred the horse into motion, dust rising in a trail behind them as the canyon swallowed the last of the sun. As the cabin came into view, the same cabin where fire had once claimed everything dear to him, Jonathan felt an old vow shatter. He had promised never again to care, never again to risk his soul for another. Yet here he was, carrying a wounded Apache woman into his home, with death chasing at their heels. Somewhere in the depths of his memory, a verse flickered, one he had not spoken aloud in years. "The Lord is close to the broken-hearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." Perhaps, he thought, it was not just her soul that needed saving. To continue this adventure, please subscribe to our channel. It helps us keep creating. The cabin smelled of smoke and dust, the walls still scarred from the fire that had stolen everything from Jonathan years before. Now it sheltered another wounded soul. Maya lay on the sagging couch, her dark hair spilling over the faded fabric, her face pale but eyes sharp, watching him with the wary look of someone who had spent a lifetime surviving. Jonathan cleaned her wounds with a gentleness that surprised even him, his rough hands awkward as they pressed cloth to her thigh. She winced but did not cry out. He had seen hardened soldiers break under less pain, yet this woman held her silence as if pain were an old companion. The days turned slow. Each morning the desert sun rose bright and merciless, pouring heat over the ranch. Maya began to move again, limping to the porch, breathing the dry air as though she could draw strength from it. Jonathan watched from a distance, always silent, always guarded. One evening, when the shadows grew long, he found her crouched near the creek behind the cabin. Her skirt was lifted just enough to keep from the water, her fingers dipping into the current to rinse a handful of leaves. She placed them on a flat stone and crushed them with rhythmic patience, her lips moving softly as if reciting words older than the canyon itself. He stepped closer, boots crunching, and she turned, eyes flashing. "Medicine," she said simply, holding up the green pulp. She rubbed it over the wound on her thigh, the smell of sage and desert mint rising between them. Jonathan knew little of herbs, only the harsh bite of whiskey and the sting of gunpowder. Yet here was another kind of knowledge, one that healed instead of destroyed. For the first time in years, his cabin filled with something other than ash and emptiness. It carried the scent of life. That night, as the desert cooled, Maya sat by the hearth. Her voice lifted in a low melody, a song without words but heavy with longing. It was a lullaby, Apache in its cadence, soft yet filled with a strength that tugged at something deep in him. Jonathan leaned against the doorframe, listening. The memory of another voice stirred, his wife singing hymns in the same corner, their son giggling before sleep. He closed his eyes, but the memory cut too sharply. The fire in the hearth flickered, and he pressed his palm against the charred wooden cross hanging by the wall. Maya's song ended, and silence returned. She did not look at him, but he felt the weight of her presence filling the room. For the first time in years, he realized he was not alone in his grief. Different worlds, different faiths, but both carrying scars too deep to name. She tended her wounds with herbs. He clung to verses half forgotten, both searching for something beyond survival. When she rose, her steps still unsteady, Jonathan moved forward without thinking, his hand brushing her elbow to steady her. The contact was brief, but she stiffened, then allowed it. Her eyes lifted to his, guarded yet not hostile, and he saw a flicker of trust, or perhaps only exhaustion. Either way, it was more than he expected. He stepped back, his jaw tight, but the air between them carried a tension he could not ignore. The desert night pressed in, filled with the chorus of crickets and distant coyotes. Jonathan sat awake long after she had fallen asleep, staring into the fire. He told himself it was duty that kept him watching her, that he could not risk strangers on his land. But deep inside, he knew it was something else. The echo of her song still clung to him, twined with the memory of hymns long silenced. Something was stirring in the ashes of his heart, fragile and dangerous, and he did not yet know if it was mercy or ruin. The days lengthened into a fragile routine. Jonathan worked the fences, repaired the corral, fetched water from the well. Maya, though still limping, followed slowly behind, gathering desert herbs and laying them to dry on the porch. They did not speak often. Silence had been Jonathan's closest companion for years, but with her it felt different, less like a shield, more like a language they both understood. Yet at night, when the wind carried its cold breath through the canyon, old memories pressed on him harder than the desert heat. One evening he sat at the table, oil lamp casting shadows across his face, the rifle he had not touched in years lying across his knees. His fingers traced the worn stock as if recalling its weight in darker times. The war had carved lines into him that never faded. He had stood at Shiloh, at Stone's River, at Chickamauga, watching men fall beside him in waves. He had survived when better men did not. That guilt never left. It clung like smoke in his lungs. He had laid down the rifle years ago, swearing never to kill again, but the ghosts of those fields still followed him into every night. Maya's voice broke his thoughts. She had moved close without him noticing, quiet as shadow. She carried a bundle of sage, her eyes catching the lamplight. "You hold that weapon like it still belongs to you," she said softly. Jonathan's jaw tightened. "It doesn't," he answered, "not anymore." She studied him for a long moment, then lowered herself into the chair across from him. From the pouch at her side, she drew a small carved figure, worn smooth with age. She set it on the table between them. "This is White Painted Woman," she explained. "In our stories, she gave birth to the twins who fought the monsters and made the world safe for us. But before that, she walked through fire and pain. She bled, she wept, yet she endured. Because of her, our people endure too." Her fingers lingered on the carving, reverent, steady. "Pain does not end a story," she said. "Sometimes it begins one." Jonathan stared at the figure, the firelight flickering across its features. He thought of his wife's hymns, of the verse she loved to repeat. "Weeping may stay for the night, but joy comes in the morning." He had buried those words with her, convinced no morning would ever come again. Yet hearing Maya speak, something within him shifted, like earth cracking after a long drought. "You believe that?" he asked quietly. Maya met his gaze, her dark eyes unwavering. "I must," she said. "If I do not, then the fire that took my kin will have won." She did not elaborate, but in her silence Jonathan sensed a grief as deep as his own. The cabin seemed smaller in that moment, the distance between them shrinking, though neither moved. Two worlds, one scarred by war, the other by conquest, sat across a table with a rifle and a carving between them. Jonathan set the weapon aside. Maya returned the figure to her pouch. For a brief heartbeat, it felt like a pact unspoken, his vow of silence meeting her vow of endurance. When she rose, her skirt brushed the table leg, her steps slow but sure. Jonathan watched her disappear into the small room where she slept. He sat alone again, but the silence was no longer empty. It carried the echo of her story, the reminder that even monsters and fire could be survived. And though he would not say it aloud, he found himself clinging to her words, as if they were a lifeline stretched across the canyon of his heart. The sound of hooves came at dusk, carrying dust and memory into the yard. Jonathan looked up from the corral and saw a rider approaching, tall in the saddle, hat pulled low. Eli Turner swung down with the stiffness of age and miles, his gray mustache bristling as he crossed the yard. Jonathan hadn't seen him in months, but friendship between old soldiers rarely needed words. They clasped hands briefly, the silence saying more than greetings could. Eli's gaze shifted to the porch, where Maya stood with a pail of water balanced against her hip. Her hair caught the fading light, loose and wild, her stance cautious yet unbowed. For a moment, Eli said nothing. Then he spat into the dust and shook his head. "You've got company, Hale, and not the kind this town looks kindly on." Jonathan's jaw tightened. She's hurt, needed help. Eli's eyes narrowed, heavy with both concern and suspicion. Hurt or not, folks in town are already talking. An Apache woman on your land after all that's happened out here? You're stirring a nest you don't want stirred. He lowered his voice, stepping closer. Men lost wives, children to raids. They don't see her as a woman, they see her as a reminder. Maya had paused on the steps, the water sloshing softly in the bucket. She could not hear the words, but she read the tone, the glances. Her shoulders stiffened, and slowly she turned, disappearing inside the cabin without a sound. Jonathan felt the weight of that silence press against his chest. "I didn't ask for her to come," Jonathan said at last. "No," Eli replied, "but you didn't send her away either, and that makes her yours in the eyes of the town. You know how fast tongues wag. You've been living quiet, trying to keep peace. Don't throw that away on someone you don't even know." The words cut sharper than Eli meant them to. Jonathan looked toward the cabin door, still swinging faintly from where Maya had passed. He remembered the way her song had filled the room, the carving of white-painted woman on the table, the strength in her silence. She was not just someone. She was a storm that had already taken root inside him. Eli must have read the defiance in his eyes, because his tone softened. "I'm only warning you. Trouble follows these things. She may carry more than scars, Jonathan. Ask yourself what she's running from." Jonathan didn't answer. He watched Eli mount and ride back into the desert, dust rising in his wake. The yard grew still again, except for the creak of the windmill turning slow against the twilight. Inside, Maya sat by the hearth, her hands still around the bucket's handle, though the water had spilled halfway across the floor. She didn't look at him when he entered. Instead, she braided her hair with deliberate care, each twist tight and precise, as if weaving walls between them. Jonathan wanted to speak, to break the silence Eli had left behind, but no words came. Instead, he stood there, the space between them stretched taut with things unsaid. Doubt gnawed at him, not of her strength or her pain, but of the truth she kept hidden. Outside, the desert darkened. Inside, the fire popped and hissed. Between them, trust remained a fragile thread, straining under the weight of suspicion. The morning broke with a sky the color of copper, the air heavy with heat before the sun had even climbed the ridge. Jonathan rose early, as always, but unease shadowed his steps. Near the north fence, the sand was pressed with tracks too clean, too heavy for ranch hands. Not the worn boots of a cattleman, not the scatter of a deer. These prints moved with purpose, circling, watching. He crouched low, touching the soil, the old instincts from darker days returning like a wound reopening. Someone had been here, and not long ago. He returned to the cabin with his jaw set, his mind turning over old vows. Inside, Maya was grinding herbs at the table, her hands steady, the scent of sage filling the air. She looked up when he entered, reading his silence the way one reads storm clouds. "What did you see?" she asked, her voice calm but edged with knowing. Jonathan hesitated, then answered flatly. "Tracks. Not mine, not yours. They're close." Her eyes narrowed, but she did not flinch. Slowly, she reached for the pouch at her side, the one she kept tied with rawhide, never leaving her grasp. For days, she had carried it like a shadow, but never opened it before him. Now, she untied the knot with deliberate care and set it on the table. The leather was worn, darkened by sweat and dust. She slid it toward him. "This is why they follow me," she said. Jonathan frowned, but pulled the flap open. Inside was a folded hide, brittle with age, marked with lines and symbols burned deep into the surface. He studied it in the flickering lamplight, and the truth struck him. It was a map, not of rivers or trails men would know, but of canyons, springs, and places marked with signs sacred to a people not his own. "It leads to our holy ground," Maya said quietly. "Land the railroad men want, land Cain wants. He thinks there is silver there, gold perhaps, but it is not his to take. This is the heart of my people." Jonathan stared at the hide, then at her. He thought of Eli's warning, of the whispers in town, of men who saw only bloodlines and scars. His chest tightened with the weight of choice. He had vowed never again to fight, never again to kill. Yet here was danger laid bare in his cabin, danger he had carried home in his own arms. Maya met his eyes, fierce and unyielding. "I did not ask you to keep me," she said, "but now you know why they hunt me. If you turn me out, they will find me. If you keep me here, they will come for both of us." Jonathan's hand brushed the charred cross on the wall, the one thing the fire had spared. Words rose unbidden from memory, words he had long buried. "Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." The verse rang hollow and heavy at once. Truth had come to his door, and with it chains of a different kind. He folded the hide and slid it back into the pouch. His voice was low, almost hoarse. "You've given me no easy choice." "No," Maya replied, her gaze steady, "but the desert never gives easy choices." Outside, the wind shifted, carrying dust across the yard. Somewhere beyond the ridge, riders would be tightening their circle. Jonathan felt it in his bones. The time for silence was ending. Night settled heavy over the canyon, the kind of stillness that made even coyotes hold their breath. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low, throwing restless shadows across the walls. Jonathan sat at the table, oil lamp dim, while Maya knelt near the hearth, grinding herbs with slow, deliberate strokes. Each movement pulled the fabric of her blouse tight against her shoulders, each shift of her hand catching the light on her skin. He told himself not to look, but his eyes betrayed him. Maya's voice cut through the silence, calm but edged with a tease. "You're staring." Jonathan's throat tightened. "Not polite," he muttered, yet his gaze lingered despite the warning. She lifted her chin, meeting his eyes with a boldness that both unsettled and pulled him closer. "Then don't be polite." The fire popped, sparks spiraling upward. Jonathan rose slowly, boots creaking on the wooden floor. He crossed the space between them as if drawn by a force he could neither name nor resist. She did not move, though her breath quickened, her lips parting just enough to betray the storm beneath her calm. When he reached her, he hesitated, hand hovering near her waist. His fingers brushed against her arm, calloused skin catching on her softness. She stiffened, then softened, the air between them charged like a storm waiting to break. Maya tilted her head, her hair falling over her shoulder, brushing his chest. Jonathan's hand rose to her neck, thumb grazing the quick pulse beneath her skin. For the first time in years, his heart raced not from fear or rage, but from want. The world narrowed to her eyes, her breath, the space that separated lips from lips. Then it came, a sharp crack outside, sudden and deliberate. Not the rustle of desert wind, not the cry of an animal. A twig broken under a boot. Jonathan froze, his hand falling away. Maya stiffened, eyes flashing. The spell shattered, replaced by the weight of danger pressing against the cabin walls. Jonathan moved to the window, lifting the lamp just enough to catch the outline of fresh tracks in the moonlit dirt. His gut twisted. They were not alone. He reached for the rifle on the wall, the cold steel foreign yet familiar in his grip. Maya rose to her feet, her knife already in her hand, blade glinting in the firelight. She did not tremble. Her stance was fierce, steady, as if she had lived her whole life waiting for this night. "They're here," she whispered, her voice steady, though her chest rose and fell with the remnants of their almost touch. Jonathan glanced at her, the fire painting her face in gold and shadow. A moment ago, she had been temptation, fragile and dangerous. Now she was steel, a woman ready to fight. The ache in his chest was not just fear of the men outside. It was fear of losing her before he had even begun to know her. He lowered his voice, calm and sharp. "Stay close. Don't move unless I tell you." She gave a single nod, dark eyes gleaming. Outside, the desert had grown watchful, silent as breath held in the throat. Inside, two hearts beat hard against the coming storm. Dawn broke pale and cold, a gray veil draped over the desert. Jonathan had not slept. He sat on the porch, rifle across his knees, the weight of it a silent confession. The tracks from the night before lingered in his mind like ghosts circling the cabin. Inside, Maya moved quietly, stoking the fire, her presence a steady rhythm against the unease. Neither spoke of what had almost happened by the hearth. The silence between them was no longer awkward. It was taut, like the string of her bow drawn and waiting. A rustle in the brush snapped Jonathan's head up. His hand tightened on the rifle, eyes narrowing on the tree line. From the shadows emerged a figure moving swift and low. It was not one of Cain's men. It was Taza, Maya's kin, his face marked by the dust of long travel, his eyes grim with urgency. He crossed the yard without hesitation, clasped Maya's forearm, then turned to Jonathan. "Cain rides," he said, his voice rough with dust. 8 men with him. By noon, they will be here." Maya's hands tightened around the pouch at her belt. She pulled it close, as if to shield it from the air itself. Jonathan's gaze dropped to it, then back to her face. He had seen men fight and die for maps, for scraps of land marked with lines. But the way she held this pouch told him it was more than treasure. Maya's eyes met his, steady but heavy with sorrow. "It is not gold he hunts. This map leads to the springs where my people are born, the places we bury our dead. If Cain takes it, he takes what is sacred. If he wins, my people lose everything that makes us who we are." Jonathan felt the words cut deep. He thought of Shiloh, Chickamauga, the fields soaked in blood for causes men claimed were noble. He had buried his rifle after the war, swearing never to kill again. But as he looked at Maya, her chin high though fear shadowed her eyes, he knew the desert was forcing his hand. Taza reached into his satchel, placing a small bundle on the porch. "Thorns, cords, tools," he said. "We can set snares, but they will not be enough without your gun." His eyes locked on Jonathan's. "You know this." Jonathan's jaw clenched. He looked down at the rifle, the steel glinting faintly in the rising light. His hand trembled once, then steadied. He had promised his wife, in the smoke of the fire that had taken her, that he would not let death rule him any more. But now death was coming, not for him, but for the woman who had walked into his silence and brought breath back to his cabin. Maya stepped forward, her hand brushing his arm. "If you stand with me, we may yet endure. If you turn away, they will crush us both." Jonathan closed his eyes, and for a moment he heard the echo of scripture he had buried with his past. "The truth will set you free." The truth was this: he could not stand idle, not anymore. When his eyes opened, resolve had replaced the hesitation. He rose, cradling the rifle with a steadiness he thought he had lost forever. "Then we fight," he said. The desert wind picked up, carrying dust across the yard. Noon was coming fast. The journey to explore the Wild West is still long. Subscribe to hear more true stories. If you're still watching, drop a 1 in the comments. The desert held its breath. From the ridge, a line of riders emerged, their silhouettes black against the copper sky. Dust rose behind them in a swirling storm, catching the light like smoke from a battlefield. Jonathan stood on the porch, rifle resting against his arm, watching them draw closer with the steady inevitability of judgment. 8 men, led by Cain, broad-shouldered, scarred, his black coat flapping like the wings of a vulture. Maya stepped beside him, bow in hand, her dark eyes narrowed against the glare. The sight of Cain stirred something in her face, fear, yes, but hardened into defiance. Jonathan felt it too, a knot tightening in his chest. This was the hour he had long dreaded, the one no prayer of silence could avoid. There was no more turning away. "They'll reach us before noon," he said, voice low. "Then we make ready," she answered. Together they moved across the yard, swift and deliberate. Maya crouched near the corral, stringing a line of rawhide laced with mesquite thorns, her fingers deft despite the limp in her step. Jonathan hauled heavy stones from the creek bed, stacking them above a ridge of brush where a rope snare would release at the pull of a trigger. Sweat streaked his temples, the sun glaring down, but his hands moved with the precision of a soldier who had built barricades under cannon fire. Inside the barn, they scattered broken glass along the floor, knowing any intruder who entered would pay in blood. Near the well, Maya dug shallow pits, covering them with brush and sand, traps that might cripple a careless rider. Each task was small, almost desperate, yet each one felt like a prayer, their way of telling the desert they would not surrender without a fight. When the work was done, Jonathan leaned against the fence, chest heaving. Maya joined him, her hands raw, dirt streaked across her cheek. Their eyes met, and for a moment the world shrank to just the two of them, standing against the tide. "This land has seen blood before," Jonathan murmured, glancing at the canyon walls, red as open wounds. Maya's voice was steady, carrying the weight of centuries. "And it will see it again, but today it will not take us quietly." The wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of hooves, closer now, measured and relentless. Jonathan gripped his rifle, the cold steel biting into his palm. For years he had sworn never to take another life. Yet here he stood, traps laid, weapon ready, a man poised once more for war. He looked at Maya, her bow strung tight, her stance fierce against the vast sky. She met his gaze and gave a single nod. Whatever happened next, they had crossed the line together. The riders crested the final rise, Cain at their head, his scar catching the sun like a brand. He raised a hand, and the column slowed, fanning out across the plain. Dust swirled, the distance between hunter and hunted closing to nothing. Jonathan breathed deep, the desert air sharp in his lungs. This was the point of no return. The first shot cracked the silence wide open. Cain's men spurred their horses, dust exploding beneath pounding hooves. Jonathan raised his rifle, breath steady despite the fire racing through his veins. He squeezed the trigger. One rider toppled from the saddle, rolling hard into the dust. The canyon echoed with gunfire, the sound ricocheting off stone walls like a storm of iron. Maya loosed an arrow, the string snapping sharp. The shaft flew straight, burying itself into a rider's arm. He howled, clutching the wound as his horse veered wildly. She reached for another arrow, her movement swift, her eyes sharp as flint. Jonathan caught a glimpse of her in the corner of his vision, strong, unyielding, alive in the chaos. Cain shouted orders, his voice booming above the din. 2 riders split left, circling toward the barn. Another 3 charged straight at the porch. Jonathan fired again, the recoil slamming into his shoulder. Another rider falling with a cry. But the others pressed on, relentless. Then the first trap snapped. A horse barreled into the rawhide line strung with mesquite thorns. The animal screamed, rearing as blood streaked its legs. The rider tumbled backward, landing hard. Before he could rise, Maya was there, knife flashing in her hand. She struck quick, efficient, leaving him writhing in the dirt. By the well, another horse plunged into a pit disguised with brush. The beast collapsed, its rider thrown headfirst into the sand. Jonathan seized the moment, firing again, dust erupting near the fallen man's chest. Silence followed, too final to mistake. The barn doors crashed open, 2 men rushing in. A heartbeat later, curses split the air as their boots met the glass Jonathan had scattered. Shards sliced through leather, blood darkening the dirt floor. One stumbled out limping, only to meet Maya's arrow square in the thigh. He dropped, screaming, before crawling toward cover. Gunfire crackled from all sides, bullets biting into the porch beams, splintering wood into Jonathan's face. He ducked, reloaded, then rose again, his eye sharp down the barrel. Another shot, another rider slumped sideways, his hat flying into the dust. Through the chaos, Jonathan's focus never wavered. Years of war and bounty hunting had carved skill into his bones, skills he thought he had buried. Now they rose unbidden, precise and deadly. Each pull of the trigger was a vow broken, yet also a shield for her. Maya crouched by the corral, bow drawn, her dark hair whipping in the wind. She loosed arrow after arrow, her rhythm steady as heartbeat. When her quiver thinned, she gripped her knife, lips pressed tight, eyes scanning for the next opening. The yard was a storm, dust rising, gun smoke choking, men shouting, horses screaming. Bodies littered the sand, the air thick with iron and fire. Yet the fight was not done. Cain still rode tall at the ridge, watching, waiting for the moment to strike. Jonathan wiped the sweat and blood from his brow, heart hammering. He knew this was only the beginning. The real battle had yet to come. The gunfire thinned, leaving only the hiss of dust and the groans of the wounded. Jonathan wiped grit from his face, eyes scanning the yard. 4 of Cain's men lay still, 2 more crawled for cover. Yet the fight had not ended, far from it. From the ridge, Cain dismounted, his boots striking the earth with slow, deliberate weight. He walked forward as if bullets meant nothing, his black coat dragging in the dirt, his scar catching the harsh light. The air shifted with his presence, heavy and dangerous, like the moment before a storm breaks. "Jonathan, hail!" His voice cut through the canyon, deep and ragged with old fury. "Did you think I'd forget Abilene?" Jonathan stiffened, the name a blade twisting in his gut. Memory surged unbidden. A gunfight in the narrow streets, smoke thick. Cain left bleeding in the dust, while Jonathan rode away, choosing survival over honor. He had buried that night, like so many others, under vows of silence. But here it was, dragged into the open. "You left me to die!" Cain roared, his eyes wild. "Cut me down and rode off with blood on your boots.
I crawled through dirt while the buzzards circled. You think a man forgets that?" Jonathan gripped his rifle tighter, but his throat closed. He had no defense, no words to wipe the stain. Every sin he had tried to bury returned with Cain's voice, louder than gunfire. Maya, crouched by the corral, turned to look at him. For the first time, she saw not just the rancher who mended fences, not just the man who carried her from the canyon, but the shadow of another life. His jaw hard, his eyes cold, his rifle steady as if molded to his hand. The war, the bounty hunts, this was the man who had survived by killing. Cain spread his arms wide, mocking. "Show her, Hale, show her what kind of man you really are. A coward, a killer, a man who saves no one but himself." The words hit harder than bullets. Jonathan's pulse thundered, his chest tight. He thought of the charred cross inside the cabin, of the promise he had made by its glow. Yet here stood the truth he could not deny. He was a man who had turned his back on others, who had chosen silence over salvation. Maya's voice cut through, steady but sharp.
"You are not that man now." Her gaze held him, fierce and unyielding, even as arrows still trembled in her quiver. "What you choose today is what you are." Cain's laughter echoed, bitter and cruel. "We'll see, girl, we'll see." He raised his pistol, the steel gleaming. Behind him, his remaining men shifted, readying for another charge. Jonathan lifted his rifle, the weight of it no longer strange. The past clawed at him, the present demanded him, and for the first time he knew there was no running from either. The reckoning had come. The silence cracked like glass. Cain's hand dropped, and his men surged forward. Gunfire roared again, louder, closer, bullets ripping through the dry air. Jonathan's shoulder slammed into the porch beam as splinters flew past his cheek. He swung the rifle up, sighted, and fired. One rider fell hard, his body tumbling beneath the hooves of another horse. The first trap snapped. A rope gave way, sending a load of stones crashing down the ridge. Dust and rock thundered into the yard, scattering riders in panic. One horse reared, throwing its rider straight into Maya's path. She struck like lightning, knife flashing, the blade glinting crimson before the man even hit the ground. Jonathan ducked low, pulling Maya back against the water trough as bullets chewed the dirt around them. Her breath was ragged in his ear, her bow pressed to her side. For a moment, the world shrank to her warmth, the fire in her eyes. Then the roar of gunfire yanked them apart again. She rose first, loosing an arrow that streaked through the smoke and buried itself in a rider's chest. Jonathan followed, his rifle cracking, dropping another before he could draw. They moved together without words. He covered her flanks, she cut down those who slipped past his line. The rhythm was raw, violent, but it was theirs. Another trap snapped, a hidden snare tightening around a horse's legs. The beast screamed, collapsing, pinning its rider beneath. Jonathan moved fast, but Maya was quicker. She leapt forward, her knife catching the firelight, and ended the struggle with a clean, brutal strike. She looked up at him, breathless, her hair plastered to her brow with sweat. In her eyes, he saw not fear, but the same relentless will that burned in his own. Cain's voice bellowed above the chaos. "Fight me, Hale! Show her who you are!" Jonathan ignored him, firing again, his focus locked on keeping Maya alive. He had fought for pay, for survival, for orders shouted over drums and cannon. But this was different. Every pull of the trigger, every move of his body was for her. Smoke thickened, choking the yard. Horses shrieked, men cursed, the ground shook with the frenzy of battle. Jonathan and Maya pressed shoulder to shoulder against the barn wall, blood streaking their clothes, eyes locked. He had not known he could trust again. She had not known she could lean on another. Yet here they were, fighting as one. A bullet whistled past, grazing Jonathan's arm. He hissed, but steadied, reloading with grim resolve. Maya's hand brushed his, quick and steady, passing him another cartridge. Their fingers lingered for a heartbeat, a silent vow made in the middle of the storm. The yard was a graveyard of traps sprung and bodies fallen. Yet still Cain advanced, relentless, cutting through the smoke with a smile that promised more blood. Jonathan wiped the sweat and blood from his brow, set his jaw, and stepped out into the open, Maya at his side.
Whatever came, they would face it together. Through the haze of smoke and dust, Cain strode forward, pistol raised, his scar lit like a brand of vengeance. The chaos around them seemed to fall away, men groaning, horses shrieking, the crack of distant shots fading into a single point of focus. It was Cain against Jonathan, the past against the present, hatred against resolve. Jonathan lifted his rifle, but before he could fire, Cain squeezed first. The bullet slammed into the porch post inches from Jonathan's head, showering him with splinters. He ducked, rolled, and came up firing. The shot grazed Cain's coat, spinning him half a step, but the outlaw only laughed, teeth bared like a wolf. "Still too slow, Hale," Cain snarled. He lunged, grabbing Jonathan's rifle barrel, wrenching it aside. The two men crashed into the dirt, fists and steel colliding in a frenzy. Jonathan's knuckles split on Cain's jaw, the taste of iron thick in his mouth as Cain's fist smashed into his ribs. Pain burned hot, but he clung to the fight with the stubbornness of a man who refused to yield. They rolled in the dust, boots kicking up sand, blood streaking both their faces.
Cain drew a knife from his belt, the blade flashing. He slashed, catching Jonathan's arm. Hot blood spilled down his sleeve, his grip faltering for a heartbeat. Cain pressed the advantage, driving the knife closer, closer to Jonathan's throat. Maya's cry pierced the din. She sprinted forward, knife in hand, but one of Cain's men staggered from cover, firing wild. She ducked, arrowing her blade into his chest, but the delay cost her precious seconds. Jonathan felt the knife's cold edge graze his neck. His muscles screamed, his chest heaved, but his eyes locked on Maya, her figure fierce against the smoke, fighting her way toward him. Something deep within him surged, the part of him that had once buried men at Shiloh, at Abilene, at nameless towns across the West. He had sworn that part dead, but now, for her, he called it back. With a roar, he twisted, driving his knee into Cain's side, breaking the outlaw's grip. The knife slipped, cutting deep into Jonathan's shoulder instead of his throat. Pain seared white-hot, but he forced himself up, fists hammering Cain's face, one after another, until blood mixed with dust. Cain spat, grinning through broken teeth.
"That's the Hale I remember." Jonathan staggered, blood soaking his shirt, chest heaving. Yet he did not back down. He had nothing left to hide, nothing left to deny. He was fighting not for coin, not for orders, but for Maya, for the chance at redemption carved from fire and loss. Cain lunged again, the knife flashing. Jonathan braced himself, his vision narrowing, every nerve burning with defiance. Whatever came next, he knew he would not falter. Jonathan's vision swam, the world tilting under the weight of blood loss. His shirt was torn and slick with crimson, his breath ragged. Cain loomed over him, knife raised, a savage grin stretched across his scarred face. Dust swirled around them, the battle fading to silence, save for the rasp of Jonathan's lungs. Maya's bow was empty, her knife still dripping from the last man she'd felled. She saw Jonathan pinned, Cain's blade poised to end him. And in that instant, time narrowed to a single choice. Her hand went to the pouch at her belt, the sacred map, the heart of her people. Her fingers trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of what surrender meant. "Stop!" her voice rang out, sharp and clear across the yard.
Cain froze, knife hovering inches from Jonathan's throat. Maya stepped forward, her chest heaving, the pouch held high. "You want it? Here, but you let him live." Cain's eyes flicked to the leather bundle, hunger sparking. For a moment he hesitated, torn between vengeance and greed. Then he laughed low, stepping back just enough to grab the pouch as she tossed it into the dust. He snatched it up, clutching it like treasure won. "You've saved him, girl," Cain sneered, glancing at Jonathan bleeding in the dirt. "But you've lost everything else. This ain't over. I'll be back for more." He whistled sharp, and the remaining riders dragged themselves into the saddle. Within moments, dust swallowed them, leaving the yard littered with blood, broken bodies, and silence. Maya dropped to her knees beside Jonathan, pressing her hands hard against his wound. His eyes fluttered open, dazed but alive. He tried to speak, but she shook her head, tears glinting though her voice stayed fierce. "Don't you dare leave me, not after all this." He reached weakly, his fingers brushing hers.
Words escaped in a rasp. Why give it up?" Her answer came steady, unshaken. "Because no map, no land, no history means anything if you are dead. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends." The verse hung in the air like a prayer, trembling with truth. Jonathan closed his eyes, pain cutting deep, but her words sank deeper still. In that moment, he knew her sacrifice was not weakness. It was strength greater than any weapon. Maya pressed tighter on his wound, whispering soft in Apache, a rhythm like a lullaby, steady as heartbeat. Around them, the desert settled, the echo of hooves fading into distance. Jonathan's body was broken, but his spirit felt strangely whole. He had lost battles before, lost family, lost faith. But now, cradled in her fierce grip, he felt something new rising, redemption born in blood and love. The fight was over, but the war for what truly mattered had just begun. If you like this video, please comment number 9. If you don't like it, please comment number 0. And please leave a comment and share your feelings. The yard was still. Smoke drifted from the blackened fence posts, mingling with the desert wind.
Where hours before the air had thundered with hooves and gunfire, now only silence reigned. Jonathan lay inside the cabin, his shirt torn open, bandages already dark with blood. His breathing came shallow, uneven, but it came, and that was enough. Maya sat beside him, her hands stained crimson, her face streaked with dust and sweat. She had pressed her palms against his wound for what felt like an eternity, whispering prayers in both English and Apache, pleading with God, pleading with the spirits of her ancestors. At last, when his breathing steadied, she allowed herself a single shuddering breath. Through the cracked window, the desert sun was climbing again, painting the canyon walls gold. It was the same sun that had borne witness to bloodshed, yet somehow it cast light now that felt softer, almost forgiving. Maya turned her face toward it, closing her eyes. She thought of the pouch Cain had taken, the map of sacred springs, the legacy of her people. The loss cut deep, deeper than any wound. But when she looked back at Jonathan, alive, clinging stubbornly to breath, she knew she had chosen rightly. Jonathan stirred, his voice rough as gravel.
"You should have let me go." She leaned close, brushing damp hair from his forehead. "And leave me to fight alone? No, you live. That's the only way this means anything." His hand, weak but insistent, found hers.
He swallowed, eyes searching her face as if seeing her for the first time. "You gave up everything for me." Her gaze softened, though her voice held firm. "Not everything. As long as you draw breath, there is hope. Land can be taken, maps stolen, but life is the only thing we cannot replace." For a long time, neither spoke. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the faint call of a hawk wheeling overhead. Jonathan thought of his wife, his son, the ashes that had consumed them. He thought of the vow he had made never to kill again, and how he had broken it. Yet, strangely, shame did not weigh as heavy as before. Because when he had pulled that trigger, when he had fought Cain tooth and nail, he had not done it for vengeance. He had done it for her, for life, not death. By afternoon, Jonathan managed to sit up, though pain twisted through him like a knife. Maya steadied him, her arm firm around his back. Outside, the land bore scars of the fight: churned earth, broken glass, bloodstains. Yet already, life stirred again. A breeze carried the smell of sage. Somewhere down the canyon, water trickled. The desert, like them, endured. Maya gathered what herbs she could salvage, crushing leaves into a poultice. As she worked, she hummed an old song, an Apache lullaby her grandmother had sung. The melody wound through the cabin like smoke, gentle, steady, full of sorrow and resilience. Jonathan closed his eyes, listening. It reminded him of the hymns his wife once sang while rocking their boy to sleep. Different tongues, different histories, but the same longing, the same thread of faith. That night, when the stars burned sharp against the black sky, Jonathan stepped outside with Maya's help. He leaned against the porch rail, every muscle aching, but his eyes lifted upward. Maya stood beside him, her hand brushing his. Together they traced the constellations, her voice quiet as she named them in her language. "Those stars have watched over us since the beginning," she whispered. "No matter what is taken, no matter what is lost, they remain. They remind us that our story is not finished." Jonathan looked at her, the starlight etched across her face. He thought of the scripture that had once guided him, but had long lain buried in silence. "Weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning." Psalm 35. The words rose unbidden, not as a sermon, but as truth. He was wounded, scarred, broken, but he was not alone. And in that he found a fragile kind of joy. By the third day, word had spread. A rider from town brought supplies and whispers. The story of the rancher who had taken in an Apache woman and stood against Silas Cain was already curling through saloons and church pews alike. Some called Jonathan a fool, others spat the word traitor. But there were voices too, softer but stronger, that spoke of courage, of a man who had chosen to stand for something greater than himself. Eli Turner rode in near dusk, his weathered face lined deeper than before. He swung down from the saddle, his eyes roaming over the scarred yard, the patched fences, the bloodstains not yet scrubbed away by time. Jonathan stepped out, his arms still bound tight, leaning heavier on the porch rail than he would admit. Eli's gaze settled on him, then flicked to Maya, who stood in the doorway with her bow slung at her back. For a long moment, nothing was said. Then Eli gave a slow nod. "Heard you two held off Cain and his pack. Didn't reckon you had it in you anymore." Jonathan's mouth tightened. "Didn't reckon I did either." Eli's eyes softened, though his tone stayed gruff. "Town's divided. Some don't like that you're sheltering her. But others, well, others are talking different now, saying maybe times are changin'." Maya stepped forward, her chin lifted high, eyes steady. "Times always change. What matters is what you choose when they do." Eli studied her, then gave a short, almost reluctant smile. "Reckon you're right. Just keep your guard up. Cain's not the sort to forget." With that, he tipped his hat, mounted, and rode off, his figure swallowed by the coming dark. As the days slipped by, Jonathan and Maya set their hands to mending what had been broken. He drove new posts into the earth, each strike of the hammer steady, purposeful. She planted herbs behind the cabin, her fingers pressing seeds into the soil, a quiet act of defiance against despair.
At night, they shared small meals by the fire, the silence between them no longer heavy but companionable. One evening, as the last light drained from the sky, Maya sat beside the hearth, her hands folded in her lap. "The map is gone," she said quietly. "Without it, my people will struggle. Those springs, that land, it is our beginning, our end." Jonathan reached across, his hand covering hers. His voice was rough but steady. "Then we'll take it back, together." She looked at him, searching his face. There was no bravado in his eyes, no hollow promise, only a quiet resolve that steadied her heart. For the first time since the battle, her lips curved into a faint smile. Later that night, they walked to the edge of the canyon. The moon hung silver, casting long shadows across the desert floor. The land stretched endless before them, scarred yet beautiful, waiting for what would come next. Jonathan rested a hand on the porch rail, his gaze lifted skyward. "I used to believe I'd buried every good thing with the fire that took my family," he said, voice low. "But standing here, I think maybe God wasn't done with me after all." Maya slipped her hand into his, her fingers warm and sure. The stars shimmered above, endless and unbroken. She whispered, almost like a prayer, "The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." John 1:5. The words lingered, carried on the night wind, wrapping around them both. They stood in silence, two souls marked by loss, bound now by hope, gazing out into a future unwritten. The desert stretched wide, its story unfinished. But for the first time, neither feared the road ahead. Stories like Jonathan and Maya's are more than echoes of gunfire and forgotten canyons. They are reminders of the choices that shape us, of love found in the ashes of loss, and of the faith that carries us when the world grows dark. Many of you listening may know what it means to bury dreams, to stand at the edge of silence and wonder if life can begin again. The Wild West was never just about guns and dust. It was about hearts tested, about redemption carved from hardship, about two souls daring to believe in something greater. If this tale stirred memories in you or gave you a glimpse of hope, let us know. Share where you're listening from and keep riding with us for more true Wild West stories, tales of grit, grace, and the quiet courage that endures across generations. Subscribe and help us keep these stories alive.